everybody, it's Katie here from the Queen of Teen Fiction, and it is time to talk about my top books of 2016. Now, I don't know about you, but I feel like this year has gone scarily fast. Whilst I, for one, am glad that 2016 is coming to an end, because I think a lot of us can agree that it hasn't been the best year. I will say that I have read some really amazing books this year. Books, like always, have been one of the shining lights in the darkness for me. The year in general has been crap, but the literature has been on point. God bless authors and their fictional worlds for helping me escape this hellish reality. So this list has been actually really difficult to narrow down, I think. A lot more difficult than 2015. I struggled with what books to include because I feel like I didn't have as many 5-star reads this year as I did last year. I found last year quite easy to pick a lot of books to potentially go in the list, and then it was difficult to narrow them down. Whereas this year, it was difficult for me to pick out the ones that were my absolute favourites. I don't know whether that's just because I've become more critical of books this year. I feel like I read a lot of really amazing books last year and it kind of set a standard for what I was reading this year. But the books that I did read this year were really amazing, and the top 3 or 4 were really hard to narrow down. But I got there in the end. I have created a list. So let's get to it then, shall we? So number 10 on my list is a book that I had a little bit of trouble deciding whether or not it should be on the list. And that book is Songs About a Girl by Chris Russell. The reason why I had a debate with myself is that when it comes to choosing a list of favourites throughout the year, I usually tend to go with the more groundbreaking books and just the ones that I feel personally have done things that haven't really been done that much before, books that have broken the mould, just stories that offer me things that I don't see very often in YA literature, because they're the books that end up being my personal favourites, so they end up in lists like this. With this book, however, when I spoke about it in one of my monthly wrap-ups, I did say it felt like a book that I shouldn't have loved. It is about a girl getting involved with a fictional boy band, and it is a story that I've seen variations of before. The romance in there was a bit cheesy and a little bit predictable. However, from the minute I started reading this book, I could not stop. I became addicted to this story. I couldn't put it down, and I ended up finishing it in literally a couple of days. Even though it sounded like the type of plot that I usually roll my eyes to, I ended up just completely falling in love with it. I don't know what Chris Russell did to get me so hooked, but it worked. I ended up very emotionally attached to the boy band within this story, which is not like me. In real life, I don't really get into boy band fandoms. It's just something that I've never really been a part of. I like a lot of bands and I appreciate their music a lot, but I don't really get into the fandom. There's literally only one band I can think of at the moment whose fandom I can say that I am actively a part of. So I was very surprised at myself for ending up in a fictional boy band's fandom. So even though I feel like this story didn't offer me as much uniqueness as some of the other books in my list, it really did manage to suck me in, so I had to include it in my list. So the next book on my list I don't actually have a physical copy of yet, but it is Salt to the Sea by Ruta Sepetys. That is what the cover looks like, but I don't have a physical copy yet, and that makes me sad. I've mentioned before that Ruta Sepetys is one of my all-time favourite authors. Even though she's only published 3 books, when she releases a new book, I know that I'm going to love it automatically. I predicted that Salt to the Sea would tear my heart apart and mend it again, and it's exactly what the book did. I just really love how Ruta manages to take lesser known parts of history and create such a beautiful story about them. Salt to the Sea focuses on a boat that sank at the end of World War II, and it was something that I'd never heard of before I read that book. So I was very happy that that story managed to open my eyes to the real events that happened. And that's the thing I always find about Ruta's stories, is that after I read them, I end up researching so much about the actual historical events that she's written about. And because I'm a history nerd anyway, I absolutely love that I get to do that after the story. The characters in Salt to the Sea are all fantastic, and the story is heartbreaking, but it's so important. And that is why it is number 9 on my list this year. So number 8 in my top 10 books of 2016 is The Island by Olivia Levis. This book is probably one of my most surprising reads of 2016 because I didn't expect to love it as much as I did. Going into it, I didn't really know too much about it, but because it's about a young girl who gets trapped on a desert island, I assumed that it was going to be a romanticised survival story, and it just wasn't that at all. It was a genuine survival story, and it was also a story of hope and self-determination and coming to terms with things that have happened in your life. It's honestly such a fantastic read, and I'm so glad that I had the opportunity to review it because I don't think it's a book I would have thought to pick up. So I'm just really grateful that I was given that opportunity. This is one of my most recommended reads of 2016, so if you haven't picked it up, then do so. So number 7 on my list is again another book I debated quite a lot about before including it on the list, and it is Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. Whilst I really enjoyed it when I was reading it, after finishing it, the more time went on, the more I started to find issues that I had with it. When I did my original review of the script, I was really enthusiastic. When I posted my review on my blog, it was a 5-star read. But I'm starting to realise now that I only gave it 5 stars because of my love for the characters. Basically, I gave it 5 stars simply for Scorpius. I loved Scorpius Malfoy so much, and I also loved Draco within this script as well. And I think that's probably why I rated it so highly. But I've still decided to include it in the list because of those aspects of the script. I just absolutely adored them so much, and they were part of the story that I am so grateful I got to read. I still just really want to be able to see it as a play because I think I'd get to appreciate it more that way, but that's an impossibility for me. So it's not going to happen. When it comes to the script, I do have a few more issues than I did when I first read it. Another reason why I debated putting it on the list is again because I don't feel like it did anything groundbreaking. Whilst I loved getting to see these characters again, it was just there. It was a convenient story. I still wish there had been something in here that just made it really stand out. But it is still on my list because I did really love it when I was reading it, and I loved getting to be part of that excitement again. So I'm grateful that it exists. So number 6 is The Last Beginning by Lauren James. This is a book that I read recently. It was back in November, and I am still emotional about it. I loved the story so much. I've never read another story like it, and that's definitely why I've included it in my favourites. This book has time travelling and amazing diverse characters, and the writing is just so fantastic, and it's got plot twists that would leave you shook. It was a sequel that I was anticipating anyway, but I didn't expect to love it as much as I actually did, so I couldn't not include it on this list. So number 5 on the list, sitting at the halfway point, is You Know Me Well by David Levithan and Nina LaCour. This is my proof copy of the book because I still don't have a finished copy, even though I really want to get my hands on a finished copy, so I will do that at some point. This book is just so lovely. It's one of the few books that have just really made me smile. David Levithan is an author that never fails me. I always enjoy whatever he writes, and this was the first time that I'd read anything by Nina, so it also introduced me to another great author, and them writing together just worked so perfectly. This is a book that's set during Pride Week, and the end of this book is just utterly perfect, and it made me cry happy tears. It's also extremely believable because everything about the characters in this story is so real. So it's a book that's honest but still filled with hope. Honestly, this is just one you have to pick up if you need a story to make you smile, which is what we all need after this year, I think. So if you haven't got around to reading this one yet, then I would highly recommend it. And number 4 is The Sleeping Prince by Melinda Salisbury. This is a sequel to The Sin Eater's Daughter, which is Melinda's first book, and that was actually in my list of favourites last year as well. I think when I included The Sin Eater's Daughter, it was a lot higher up on the list, so I think it was around 8 or 9. The sequel is even higher up in my list of favourites because It was incredible. This is a series that just keeps improving because I really loved the first book, but then this one came along and just completely blew me out of the water. I don't know how it managed to be better than the first book, but it was. I think there's a little less focus on the romance in this one than there was in the first one, because whilst I love the first book, there was a love triangle, and I have issues with love triangles in general. Even though that was a very well written one, I still don't like them very much. This book doesn't have any of that. Whilst there is some romance in it, it's very subtle and it's a lot more slow building. Also, the main character in this, Erin, is just such a fantastic character. She is so badass. I will also say that this is probably one of the most traumatizing prologues that I've read. There is one more prologue in this list yet to come that was slightly more traumatizing, but this took the number 2 spot when it came to traumatizing prologues. It messed me up. I was not ready to be thrown into the story that way. So if you love YA fantasy and you haven't checked out Melinda's books yet, then please do, because they are great fantasy reads and they have a sort of fairy tale element to them. So the 3rd and final book comes out in 2017 and I am so eager to get my hands on a copy of it. So I'm excited to read it and also quite nervous because I think Melinda is an author that's not afraid to break hearts. So number 3 on my list is Lady Midnight by Cassandra Clare. This is the first book in the Dark Artificers trilogy, and I will admit that before reading this, I wasn't that excited about the Dark Artificers. I was still excited about it because I love the Shadowhunters world, but I wasn't as hyped for it as I was with the other series. Probably because I felt like I needed a break from that world and I didn't want to have to go back in there again, but I knew I would regardless. But then when I started reading it, oh my god. I don't know what it is about Cassandra Clare, but she can just create characters that you would willingly give your life to protect. Her characters are just so incredible and I love them so much. Even though it's a series that's set in the same world that we've already read a bunch of books from, the plot is still completely fresh and there's new things to discover. It's not like it's retelling the same story over and over again. The romance between the characters in this is different to any of the romantic storylines in The Mortal Instruments or The Infernal Devices. So it really got me sucked into this series and into these characters. And Lord of Shadows is probably my most anticipated read of 2017. In fact, you know, there's no probably about it. It is. It's literally the book that I want next year. The book. I can't wait to have my heart broken by these characters, because that's gonna happen, because it's Cassandra Clare. So number 2 on my list is a book that I didn't expect to put as my number 2, and it is Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. The reason why I didn't expect it to be so high up on my list is because before this year, I hadn't even read Six of Crows. Even though Six of Crows came out in 2015 and I'd seen a lot of buzz about it, I didn't get around to reading it until around September this year when I finally got my hands on a copy. I didn't expect this world, all these characters, to take over my life as much as they did. Six of Crows is a duology and this is the 2nd and final book. And it is so good. Honestly, I mean, I adored Six of Crows, but I feel like that book pales in comparison to its sequel. This is a book in which I loved every single one of the main characters. No one bored me. Everyone had a really great individual storyline. Also, I loved every single romantic subplot, which is very rare for me because usually I'm extremely critical of the romantic subplots in books, especially in high fantasy stories, because sometimes it can take away from the main story itself. The romance in this just added to the overall amazingness of the story. I was completely invested in all 3 relationships. I was in tears reading a certain chapter at the end of this, but I was completely in awe of the way Leigh had written it. I feel like she was very brave with this story, and so even though there were heartbreaking elements of the ending, it was perfect. It was everything that I wanted it to be. So number 1 on my list of top reads from 2016, my absolute favourite from this year, and one of my favourites of all time. It was a book that was very easily my top read of this year. The Raven King by Maggie Stiefvater really wasn't a difficult choice. This is also the winner of most traumatizing prologue. I know we've known from book 1 that Gansey was going to die, but you don't have to remind me in the prologue. I don't even have words that are sufficient enough to describe my love for this book. I am also very grateful to the online book community for making me aware of this series as well, because it's definitely a series that I wouldn't have read without people talking about it online. Because The Raven Boys, which is the first book in the series, I have looked at a few times before this year, and every single time I've read the blurb and thought, no, this isn't a book for me. I even saw it in a charity shop at the end of last year, and I read the blurb again, even though I'd read it before, and then put the book back on the shelf because I thought there was no point. I just assumed that I wouldn't like it, because it seemed like such a stereotypical YA paranormal romance. But then everyone kept talking about these books and saying how utterly fantastic they were. So this year I made the decision to actually read the first book for myself and see why it was getting all this buzz. And oh boy, am I so glad that I did. So I owe this one to the people that convinced me to actually read it, mostly on Tumblr, because without the online buzz, this is a series that I just wouldn't have picked up. I am still massively attached to the characters in this series, and I find myself now, whenever I jump into a new series, I compare the characters to these ones. There are things that just make me miss these characters when I'm reading other stories. I compare a lot of things to these books now, actually. I don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing, that no other books can live up to this one. I could go on and on for days about how much I love this book, but I don't need to because I've already talked enough about it. One of my highlights of 2016 actually was getting to go and see Maggie give a talk and actually meet her. That happened. So yeah, if you haven't read The Raven Cycle yet, read The Raven Cycle, please! Then you will know why this book is my favourite book of 2016. This is the one that sets the bar for books in 2017. So there you have it. They are my top 10 favourite books of 2016. I am the worst at choosing books to go in lists. Whenever somebody asks me the question, what's your favourite? I go into a meltdown because I'm just terrible. So you should know that there are still plenty of other books that I have really loved this year that haven't quite made it into the top 10, but I am still very grateful that they exist. I feel like 2016 has been a really great bookish year for me. It's the end of the video, so it's sentimental time. In 2016, I actually got to meet a lot of authors that I really admire. I've been able to go to quite a few book events this year, and usually I don't get to do that. One is because authors don't tend to come to a city that I can actually travel to. The second reason is that I am very anxious about going to events in general, but this year I've been able to go to more book events, and I've actually been able to talk to other people from the online book community, which is something that before this year I only did on Twitter. I didn't even go to events, let alone speak to fellow bloggers and booktubers. So I'm very proud of myself for being able to achieve that this year, because it might not seem like a big thing, but it is to me. So please do let me know what have been your favourite books from 2016. Are there any books on your list of favourites from this year that have really surprised you and that you didn't expect to love as much as you did? Also tell me what books you're looking forward to in 2017. Let me know all the bookish things down in the comments. Thank you guys so much for watching me talk about books this year. I hope we have lots of awesome books to talk about next year. But until then, bye!